Hello again, welcome to RPG Tips. In this video we will continue the Mythic Game Master Emulator series, which we started in the previous video talking about the base Game Master Emulator, which came out in 2006 by Tana Pigeon. In this one we'll talk about the Mythic Variations 1 book, which came out just 1 year after the base one in 2007, and as we'll see follows the same philosophy as the base Game Master Emulator, but it allows us to expand the capabilities of the basic tool that the base game gives us. This book, the Mythic Variations one, can be considered a sort of toolbox, and it's quite short. It's only 46 pages and it's divided into 5 chapters. These are the game mastering section, complex questions, themes, off-camera stories, and adventure outlining. So what I'm going to do is I'll go over each of these chapters, telling you what they contain and how they relate to the tools that we already know from the Game Master Emulator. The first section, Game Mastering, is actually quite simple and short, but it's very useful. I would say that this section contains 3 kinds of advices. The first one is how to run your game smoothly using the Game Master Emulator, how to solve problems that may arise. The second one is rules for, well, not actually rules, but tips on how to run cooperative games, which is very interesting because it allows you to play with your usual RPG group, but no one has to game master. And the third family of tips is refreshments actually of rules that were already presented in the previous book, but I didn't talk about them in the previous video, such as the 50-50 rule, in which if you just don't know the probabilities of something, you can just assign them randomly, so 50-50, or the I don't know rule, which means that if you're trying to interpret something and you can't come up with an interesting thing in 10 seconds or less, just say I don't know and keep going. So as you can see, this section is quite short, but it's actually very useful, especially if you have little to none experience with the system. The second section is called Themes, and it's actually the largest section in the book, and it's probably the most interesting and important one. It is important because it actually offers specific mechanics, rules for your games, so you can play with a specific theme, or you can even create your custom one. The way in which it does this is by altering 2 mechanisms of the ones that we saw in the previous video. The chaos factor and how it increases and decreases, and the random event focus table. Just with these 2, the Game Master Emulator is able to enforce a certain kind of genre in your stories. The themes already included and pre-made are 6: horror, action-adventure, social, epic, mystery, and personal. And then it has some indications on how to create your own theme. I will make a quick pass over each of these themes so you can see how very small alterations on the mechanics can lead to a specific theme in your story. Starting with horror, the alterations that are done in order to create a horror story are just 2. The chaos factor starts at 4 and only increases. This will mean that the story will start calm and relaxed and will only get crazier. And in the random event focus table, you include 1 special kind of event, which is horror. The other themes are similar. For example, in the action-adventure theme, the chaos factor cannot fall below 5, which would turn the adventure into something a bit more relaxed, and that's something we don't want in action-adventure themes. But most of the time, actually, the theme is changed through the random event focus table. So, for instance, if you have an epic theme, you have a threat escalate random event in which, for example, things that you thought that were in a certain dimension, the cult that you've just discovered is not only a cult in this city, but it's a part of a bigger cult which covers the whole world. For instance, on the mystery theme, the chaos factor cannot fall below 3, and it also gives you special tips and tricks on how to interpret the going away from a threat or moving towards a threat. Threats, if you remember, were one of the lists that we had in the previous video, in which we keep tabs on the things we are doing right now, our quests, for example, or our objectives. Apart from pre-made themes, we've also got one section in which Tana shows us how to create our own theme. And there's a very nice table on the specific effect we want to include in the story, so like for instance that the tension builds and builds, and how to translate that to actual mythic mechanics. Some other interesting effects are like that the adventure begins in a mundanely way, or that we have a specific beginning for the story. There's a full page full of interesting examples and translations between intended effect and the actual mechanics. This section ends with tips on how to mix themes and some very nice examples. I didn't say it in the last video, but one thing that characterizes the Mythic Game Master book series is that it has very good examples, probably because the author knew that this is a strange way of playing, and the oracle and random event stuff sounds a bit more abstract than normal games when you explain them, but once you see them functioning, it all comes very natural. The third section of the book is called Complex Questions, and this is something that once I was rereading the book to prepare for the video, I realized that I had already explained them in the previous video. It means using the event meaning random tables we had in the base Game Master emulator to answer some other questions, like for example, backgrounds of people, descriptions, how does the fighter fight? Abuse weakness would be a very different fighter from protect innocent. We can also use them for descriptions of places, or when we don't have any kind of idea of the odds to answer any kind of question. There is one interesting remark in which the author says that this question should be asked sparingly, so the story doesn't get derailed. In my experience, that's not true. In fact, I tend to rely on this kind of questions a lot, probably more than the just yes or no oracles. But your experience may be different, just give them a try and see what you like. The fourth section of the book is called Off-Camera Stories, and is again another example of how to use the same mechanics that we already know how to use to generate more things. This one specifically shows us how to create a background for your character using a special kind of random event focus table and the event meaning random tables that we already know. So we just roll for a specific number of events that happen in the backstory of your character, and then you roll in the event meaning tables. You join them together and you've got one backstory for your character. It also serves to create in-between stories, like what is my character doing in the 2 weeks that we've got free in this city. The last section of the book is called Adventure Outlines, and I must admit that I had forgotten completely about this section because I read the Mythic Variations book like 1 year ago, 1.5 years ago, and I was very surprised because outlining adventures is actually the topic of the last book that Wordmill has published, The Adventure Crafter. So I was very curious and surprised to see this here, and it's very interesting to see how 10 years have influenced the writing that Tana has given us. How the adventure is done is actually by generating answers, well, questions and answers, all of them in advance before the actual session is played. Even though I must admit that this section is something that I have never used and in fact is probably improved by the Adventure Crafter, it is at least one very simple way of generating a possible outline of your session and a masterful example of how to use the base mechanics for something else. And well, that was the book. 46 pages is actually very short because I've left out all of the examples that you should read if you haven't. Now, what is my opinion on this book? I consider it something obligatory if you're getting into the system. If you've just finished the base Game Master Emulator, just jump into the Mythic Variations one, because it will give you more tools to create stories. And it will show you how to use the oracles, the yes, no, and the random event tables in more varied ways. At the same time, I must admit that I find Mythic Variations 2 to be much more interesting and at the same time much more complex. Well, this was the Mythic Variations 1 video. I've got the feeling that it's going to be shorter than the base Game Master Emulator 1, and it makes sense. This one is much simpler. Now, leaving out the actual books aside, I must admit that I'm very thankful for the reaction that these videos have garnered. It's incredible to see people like the actual creator of the Mythic Game Master Emulator series, Tana, commenting on the posts that I make on Reddit showing the videos. I'm very glad that they are generating a good reaction, because I actually think that there is a niche, that we have no good systematic approach to documenting everything that solo RPG can give us. And in fact, I think that it should be more well known into the general RPG community, because not only it allows you to tell better stories or different stories, as I talked about in the introduction. It will just improve your general GMing. You're going to be a better GM if you know how to solo roleplay. Well, we can leave the philosophy of GMing for another video if you want to talk about it. The only thing I have left to say is that the next video will be about the Mythic Variations 2 book, which is a completely different beast from the one that we've just seen, because it was released 10 years after this one, and it's very, very complex, well, at least more complex than the Variations one, but it's actually my favorite book from World Games, so I hope you'll like it too. As always, thank you for coming, and I hope to see you again. Bye bye!